Hi everyone and welcome to the lecture on human aggression and violence. We know that humans have been violent for a very long time. In the nearly 6,000 years of our recorded history, we have had about 15,000 wars. That makes it about 2.6 wars every year. Nowadays, we not only fear wars, but also terrorist attacks that kill many. Due to the abundance of wars, terrorist attacks, and other man-made atrocities that actually result in us killing each other, some groups suggest that humans may be the most vicious animals for non-survival purposes. And that may not be far from the truth, because more humans die annually as a result of our own actions, or the actions of other humans that is, than for any other reason. Now, if you watch the two videos that this slide is linked to, you will see that sometimes it is not uncommon for little everyday experiences to blow up and become reasons for aggression and violence to occur in our everyday lives. In today's lecture, we will be looking at the definition of human violence and aggression. We will also be looking at how different psychological theories can actually be used to explain the development and the prevalence of violence and aggression in everyday life. And finally, we will look at some examples of violence and aggression in real life, how it affects the people around them, and also why it may occur in the first place. Now, violence and aggression is actually everywhere. It's all around us. We see it in the sporting arena, we see it in the mass media, in movies, even cartoons that little kids watch. We read about them in books, and there is so much on the online platform, like the internet, basically. So even though we may not realize it, violence and aggression is really prevalent in our everyday life, and we are exposed to it on a daily basis. As I mentioned earlier, they're prevalent in cartoons, which means that children too are exposed to it frequently. In fact, many children's cartoons, such as the very innocent-looking Tom and Jerry, are inherently violent in nature. Many popular movies that we watch are no different. In the sporting arena, many sports that children and adults either play or watch also contain elements of aggression. The actual degree of how much aggression it contains would vary among sports. Some examples of the more aggressive sports that are played in Singapore, for example, are rugby, football, hockey, and even netball, which we usually associate with females, so we assume there would be little aggression and violence, at least from a stereotypical point of view. Often, the aggressive behavior in sports is not limited to the actual athlete on the field alone, but is sometimes also evident among spectators. Aggression among spectators is mostly verbal, but sometimes it can escalate to becoming quite physical too. If you think back to many incidences of death, stampedes and fights, for example, during very popular football matches, you will see how violence there may actually come up among spectators watching a sport that they are very passionate about or very involved in. An interesting point to note is that while aggression in these areas of life expose us to aggression and violence as a whole, most people don't see anything wrong with it. In fact, it is widely accepted as part of entertainment or the sporting culture. Now, if you think about it within this context, there is actually a very thin line between what is acceptable and what is not when it comes to aggressive behaviors. The definition of what is and what isn't acceptable is also likely to vary across cultures, as they are very strongly bound by social norms. This slide summarizes the widely accepted definitions of aggression and violence. But before we go into these definitions, I want to bring to your attention 2 points. Firstly, that while aggression may hurt others, not all aggressive behaviors are considered to be criminal in nature. For example, a police officer who uses reasonable levels of force on a criminal who is trying to escape or is struggling is thought to be exercising aggression, but he is not thought to be engaging in a criminal act, as what he is doing is considered to be part of his job and part of law enforcement. Secondly, although violence and aggression may seem to be related, not all aggression is physically violent. This is something that we will explore in more detail as we look at relational aggression in one of the future slides. So, aggression then is a behavior which causes intentional harm to another person. More specifically, aggression is defined as any sequence of behavior to which the goal response is to injure the person towards whom it's directed. Although some definitions emphasize the role of intention, most psychologists agree that it is the actual observable behavior causing harm that defines aggression. Thus, aggression can also be defined as angry or violent feelings of behavior. Violence, on the other hand, is defined as behavior that is perpetrated or attempted with the intention of harming another individual, or behavior that is intended to destroy an object. Now, when studying this topic, it also serves to remember that while it may seem like these behaviors are purely negative, they are to some extent valued in sports and politics and even the corporate world. As you may have already figured out, there are some aspects of aggressive and violent behavior that researchers still cannot agree on. However, what most researchers do agree on is that both violence and aggression are usually the basic ingredients present in violent crime. Again, they do however differ in their opinions of the degree to which aggression is determined by genes, that is, it is genetic, or that it is a learned behavior. Now, this brings us back to the issue of nature versus nature that was covered in previous lectures. Now, does it really matter whether it is genetic or learned? And why does this matter within the context of criminal psychology, you may ask? It does matter because it affects our approach to not just understanding these behaviors, but also in dealing with these behaviors and their consequences. For example, if behaviors are thought of to be genetic, they're not changeable and they're not within somebody's control. Um, it is quite a pessimistic view of violence or aggression because if it is indeed biological, it is something that we cannot totally eradicate, but instead it's something that we can just try to manage and control, either at the individual level, where the individual must work hard to keep these innate tendencies in check if they are present within him or her, and secondly, societal norms or societal rules and laws should also be designed to discourage these instinctive behaviors. This is not always easy to do, also because we cannot then punish somebody for really exhibiting these behaviors because if it is genetic, it's not within his or her control. On the other hand, if we think that these behaviors are learned, that means it can also be unlearned. This is therefore a more optimistic view of violence and aggression because if it is learned, then it is not inevitable. Thus, if we know how people acquire or learn these behaviors, we can manipulate these factors in the environment to make sure that they can also either unlearn these behaviors or not even learn them in the first place. When understanding aggression, it is good to keep in mind that there are different ways that aggression can be categorized. One way it can be categorized is as either active aggression or passive aggression. As a rule of thumb, a good way to distinguish between the two is that while passive aggression may hurt another person, it is not usually considered to be a criminal act. Both active and passive aggression can be seen as direct or indirect. Examples of direct physical active aggression is punching somebody or hitting somebody, whereas indirect physical aggression that is active in nature could be when you play a practical joke on someone or you set a booby trap. So it's not so clear who the perpetrator was in the first place. When it comes to passive aggression, on the other hand, direct physical aggression would include obstructing somebody's passage by putting something in their way. So the perpetrator himself or herself is not there in the situation. Or an example of indirect physical passive aggression would be just refusing to perform a necessary task even when asked to do so. Aggression may not always be physical, it could also be verbal, where active verbal aggression would include, that is direct in nature, would be insulting the victim to his or her face, whereas indirect active verbal aggression would be by, for example, spreading gossip behind the person's back. Passive verbal aggression would be refusing to speak to somebody when it is sorry, I'm going to repeat that. Passive verbal direct aggression would be, for example, refusing to speak to somebody even when they speak to you. And passive verbal indirect aggression would be to refuse consent to allow someone to do something even when they explicitly ask you to do so. Another way to look at aggressive behaviors is to classify them as either being overt or covert in nature. One easy way to distinguish between the two types of aggression, overt and covert, is to understand that overt aggression usually involves direct confrontation or administration of physical harm. This kind of aggression usually decreases with age, as does most other violent behaviors. The emotions involved in such actions are usually very intense. They also involve high levels of arousal and anger. Usually, these acts are a result of an impulsive individual who may lack the social cognitions required to address the problem in a non-aggressive manner. These types of acts usually start early in life, particularly with boys. Covert aggression, on the other hand, is usually more sneaky in nature. It involves more concealment or dishonest behavior, and unlike overt aggression, such acts are likely to increase with age as people realize that they are less likely to be caught or sanctioned if their aggressive behaviors are covert in nature. These acts, while usually less intense, are not a result of emotional reaction. They are also more likely to have been thought through and premeditated. Examples of covert crimes include fraud and theft. And unlike overt aggression, which relies on strength, covert aggression requires a certain level of cognitive ability so the individual is able to calculate and plan his actions beforehand. Finally, covert aggression also usually involves some strategy to ensure that the perpetrator is able to escape his deeds or therefore not be punished for his aggressive actions. A third way to view aggression is either as hostile or instrumental. The main distinguishing factors between these two types of aggression is the goals or rewards that these actions offer the perpetrator. As can be seen on the screen, hostile aggression usually occurs as a response to anger-inducing situations. These situations could either be real or perceived insults or threats, for example. They're also often characterized by intense or disorganized anger and usually involves the use of force. The goal of such actions that come under hostile aggression is usually to harm the victim or to make the victim suffer. Males are usually associated with hostile aggressive acts. Instrumental aggression, on the other hand, usually does not plan to use violence. That is, being violent is not part of the goal or the action plan the perpetrator has in the first place. That is, harm is not usually intended unless it interferes with the perpetrator reaching his or her goal. It can be seen as a response to competition or as a very strong desire for a particular object regardless of its cost. Objects in this sense could refer to money, power, or even status symbols such as jewelry, designer goods, etc. Usually, the goal in practicing instrumental aggression is for personal gain, and there is usually no intent to harm the victim unless there is interference. Females are usually more likely to be associated with instrumental aggression as it is less likely to use force and more likely to be premeditated and thought through. Most of the time, both types of aggression do not occur in isolation, as most acts of aggression usually have multiple motives and therefore have a combination of both types of aggression. The law specifically does not distinguish between these two types of aggression, but instead, when it comes to punishment, it usually looks at the end result of the aggression and how much hurt has actually occurred. Now, if you look at this next slide, you'll see that you will see a picture of two boxers who are quite famous. Um, you will see actually three people in this picture. There is the Empire. There is a guy who is right in front of the Empire, that's to your left, and there's a guy to your right. What may not be clear in the slide is that the guy to your left is Mike Tyson, and what he's actually doing is biting off the ear of the guy on the right, who is Evander Holyfield. Now, what actually happened is that in 1997, Mike Tyson, who was the boxing champion at that time, was disqualified for twice sinking his teeth into Evander Holyfield's ear, biting it off and spitting it on the canvas of the boxing ring during a boxing match. And this particular boxing match was the third round of a rematch between the two biggest fighters of that time, that is Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. It was actually the kind of performance that outside the ring could be construed as a parole violation and a very serious crime because somebody was obviously hurt quite a lot. Now, when questioned, Mike Tyson was defiant in the face of disgrace, saying that he bit Holyfield in response to one of Holyfield's headbutts, which resulted in a cut opening over his right eye. So he said that he wasn't wrong and instead he was just retaliating to an action that was actually started by Holyfield. However, at a later date, in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, Tyson said that what actually happened is that he wanted so desperately to beat Holyfield in the ring that he bit his ear off because he was so angry when he realized that there was no way he could defeat Holyfield in any other way. And as a result of knowing this, he just wanted to hurt Holyfield in any way that he could before he was actually defeated. Now, this incident stands out very clearly in the minds of boxing fans, especially, but what or how it does come into our discussion today is that it is an example of how aggression can be both hostile and instrumental at the same time. In this next section, we will explore some of the psychological theories that help explain the presence of violence and aggression in our lives. From a psychodynamic perspective, Freud believed that human aggression is an instinctive drive, one that is related to the person and not the situation. He therefore says that human aggression is actually an unavoidable part of human life. He goes on to say that humans possess two basic drives from birth that contribute to the development of personality and behavior. The first is the drive for aggression, thanatos, and the second is the drive for pleasure, which is eros. These two primitive forces, he says, are the life and death instincts. Thanatos, or destructive energy, expresses itself in aggressive behaviors to others as well as self-destructive behaviors. And he goes on to say that these two primitive forces seek constant expression and satisfaction while at the same time opposing one another in our subconscious. And he believed that the conflict between these two driving forces is actually the origin of all aggressive behaviors. One model that he proposed to actually explain this is the hydraulic model of aggression. In this model, he suggested that aggressive forces build up like water in a dam, and these forces have to be released in some way. If they're not released, they will spill over into aggressive behaviors, and therefore it is important that they are dissipated before they reach dangerous levels. Thus, according to this theory, we can never eliminate aggression. We can only try to control it by channeling it into ways that involve symbolic forms of gratification. These indirect gratifications result in catharsis, that is, the release of drive energy. And if catharsis doesn't occur, it will again lead to aggressive behaviors. Psychodynamic theorists propose that catharsis can be accomplished either through actual behaviors, for example, playing football, or through vicariously watching certain behaviors, such as watching football. He says, or they say, that children who participate actively in sport or avidly watch school sports will ultimately be less aggressive than children who don't because they actually have an acceptable avenue to release their aggressive tendencies. They go on to say that people who engage in violent crime usually do so because they do not have enough opportunities to blow off this steam. Thus, they suggest that humans must be given multiple and appropriate channels for catharsis so that violent crime can ultimately be controlled. Evolutionary psychology is another branch of psychology that attempts to understand aggressive and violent behaviors. Evolutionary psychologists use a method called ethology, that is, the scientific and objective study of animal behavior, usually with a focus on behavior under natural conditions, to understand behaviors as a product of evolution. These behaviors are usually seen as an adaptive trait to help a particular species continue. This branch of psychology suggests that aggression is actually not pathological in nature, but instead it is normal behavior, especially for males, as it allows them to protect their territory and defend what is important to them. It also suggests that aggression is indeed an inherited and even an important instinct as it helps meet the following needs. Firstly, it provides individuals with the instinct to attack violators who try and violate or enter their territory without permission. And secondly, it promotes territoriality, which is important because it prevents overcrowding and ensures that the best mates are available and also enough food and nutrition for their young. Evolutionary psychologists go on to say that most species practice ritualized aggression, as ritualized aggression is indeed an important and a species preserving behavior. Ritualized aggression usually involves complicated displays of force or superiority, such as baring one's teeth, showing off one's size in relation to somebody else, and perhaps even displaying color in animals, for example, how the peacock spreads out its fan or its tail. Animals demonstrate their superiority to others to defend their territory through these ritualized behaviors. Humans, however, have moved beyond that and often practice aggression to hurt or even annihilate each other. They suggest that this makes humans one of the few species that actually practice aggressive behaviors to such an intense level and at a level that does not actually serve any evolutionary function. In fact, it may even go against the principle of evolution. Other theories suggest that while this may be an interesting explanation, it is not supported by human aggression research. These researchers suggest that humans cannot be directly compared with other animals because we differ from them in terms of, for example, our brain structure. The brain structure of human beings, for example, differs quite significantly from even our closest animal relatives, and that unlike other animals, human beings have few genetically programmed behaviors. Therefore, we cannot put down our aggressive behaviors to just evolutionary psychology because we are more likely to react to the demands of the situation or the environment that we are in instead of based purely on instinct. The frustration aggression hypothesis has been explained in detail in previous lectures. Thus, I will only summarize it here to say that individuals are likely to resort to aggressive behaviors when they feel that their ability to reach an anticipated goal is blocked in some ways. Aggression then is a natural response to these feelings. Do also watch the short video, the link is on the slide, to see how this could affect behavior in a real life situation. Cognitive theorists believe that aggression is a learned behavior. It is not something that is innate or inborn. They emphasize the importance of mental processes such as perception and thought, along with the role of learning and situational factors in understanding aggressive behaviors. Leonard Berkowitz, one of the pioneers of the cognitive neuroassociation theory, suggests that it is important that we focus on the underlying emotional and cognitive processes that underlie the frustration aggression link. This theory suggests that negative influences produced by disagreeable occurrences, and these disagreeable occurrences may be physical or psychological in nature, encourages various thoughts, expressive motor reactions, memories, and physiological reactions linked with both the fight and flight trends. These relations, as a result, enhance basic feelings of anger in the fight response or basic feelings of fear in the flight response. The aversive events producing negative affect could include frustration, provocation, loud noises, uncomfortable temperatures, and even unpleasant odors sometimes. At the earlier stages, the model suggests that cognitive processes have little influence beyond the immediate appraisal, which explains why some people may act quickly and based on impulse. Take, for example, a teenager who is frustrated with school and vandalizes the school bus as a result of this frustration and aggression. At the later stages, the theory suggests that cognitive appraisal plays a bigger role to mediate emotional reactions, and this then results in more controlled reactions. Displaced aggression theory, on the other hand, basically suggests that aggression is actually displayed at somebody who is the target or victim who just happens to be in the wrong place or the wrong time. The theory suggests that aggression is displaced because the individual cannot aggress against the actual source of provocation. As a result, he or she takes out that feeling of aggression and frustration on the innocent party who is mildly annoying. Take, for example, a parent who is very frustrated at his or her boss at work. He is unable to express that frustration towards his or her boss because of social norms of the office. He comes home bringing back feelings of frustration, and he or she may react excessively towards his or her child, for example, who accidentally spills a cup of milk on the table. Because of this pent-up frustration, he or she may punish the child more harshly or may shout at the child more loudly than he or she would have if the displaced aggression wasn't there in the first place. In previous lectures, we have discussed in great length how social learning can influence the development of criminal or deviant behaviors. In the next few slides, we will build on this knowledge and focus on how these same theories can be applied to the development of aggressive tendencies or behaviors. As with other deviant behaviors, aggressive behaviors can be learned either through direct experience or by observing others' behaviors and the consequences of their actions. These observable behaviors include ways to harm others, either overtly or covertly, which groups may be the appropriate targets for aggressive behaviors, especially if we're dealing with displaced aggression, what kind of actions by a particular individual or group justify aggressive retaliative behaviors or even violent retaliative behaviors, and finally, in what situations or on what premises is aggression permitted or approved within the context of the social norms that they are acting within. Bandura has identified three major types of models or three major types of role models when looking at how aggressive behaviors can be learned through modeling. The three major types of role models that he had identified are family members, members of one's own subculture, for example, one's immediate peers, and symbolic models who are not in one's own subculture but are instead accessible through the mass media. In his research, he suggested that family members, especially parents, are very powerful role models, at least up till early adolescence. At this stage, they start playing a less important role and peers start playing a more important role. Unsurprisingly, he suggests that levels of aggression are highest in groups where aggressive models are easily accessible and when violence is valued. Since parents are important role models, it is also not surprising that aggressive or antisocial parents tend to produce similar offspring. Specifically, excessive physical punishment from parents was found to be related to aggressive behaviors even in children as young as 2 or 3 years old. The mass media, which includes the TV, the internet, and print media, also provide many models, although they may be symbolic models as they're not so easily accessible face-to-face. The importance of these symbolic models is especially pertinent in today's society when children are exposed to these forms of media from a very early age. Thus, it suggests that if there are symbolic models that children or even adolescents look up to, who engage in aggressive or violent behaviors, even though it is fictional and on screen, their behaviors are more likely to be imitated. Bandura also suggested that behavior is likely to be imitated if there is motivation to repeat the behavior. For example, a mass murderer may get an idea from the descriptive accounts of another killing. He may think about the incident again and again, and it may feature prominently in his mind long after it has been forgotten by others. The mass murderer may continue to think about the crime and rehearse the scenarios mentally until an appropriate condition presents itself for him to repeat the behaviors. Secondly, the consequences of the model's behavior is also or will also influence the likelihood of imitation. If a model is aggressive and is punished for his behavior, it is unlikely to be repeated. However, if the model gets away with aggressive behavior or is even rewarded for the behavior, the likelihood of imitation is much, much higher. Finally, for aggressive behavior to be maintained, it does require periodic reinforcement, and this usually occurs through instrumental learning. In the sense that if aggressive behavior brings about rewards, it is likely to be imitated and continued. Cultures of honor are cultures where people intentionally avoiding others and place a strong emphasis on maintaining a certain reputation and for not accepting improper conduct or what is considered to be improper conduct by others. Within these cultures, there are often very strong norms that indicate either directly or indirectly that aggressive behaviors are not just acceptable, but are also the appropriate and correct response when one's honor is insulted. As a result of this belief, there are social norms within these societies that indicate what responses are appropriate to insults or even perceived insults to one's honor. Within these cultures, sexual jealousy is also more likely to result in violence. Do click on the link here to watch a video that depicts how the culture of honor theory helps to explain differences in reactions amongst Northern and Southern Americans. Now, not all of this video is in English, but there are subtitles when it is not in English, and more importantly, it does explain how and why cultural factors may influence aggressive behaviors. Huseman suggests that aggressive behaviors in particular are also controlled by cognitive scripts. Cognitive scripts are basically our thought processes which are learnt or memorized through our daily experiences. These experiences could either be learned directly through our own experiences or indirectly by observing significant others, their actions and the consequences of their actions. These scripts suggest what events are likely to happen, how the person should behave, and the likely consequences of their actions or the likely outcomes of their behaviors. These scripts are unique to the individual, but once they're established, it usually becomes resistant to change and is likely to follow the person to adulthood, especially if it is practiced from time to time. The individual's evaluations of the appropriateness of a particular script determines which scripts are stored, retrieved, and then utilized. When deciding on which scripts should be utilized, emotions also play a role in the selection of the scripts. For example, an angry person is more likely to choose a hostile script compared to somebody who is happier. The hostile attribution bias suggests that those who are prone to violence are also those who are more likely to interpret ambiguous actions as being more hostile and threatening. That is, what it is suggesting is that when someone infers that when an act was committed with hostile intent, they are more likely to react to this act with hostility. For example, aggressive and violent youth are known to have hostile attribution biases, and therefore they interpret events in a more negative light. For example, if I had innocently placed my foot very casually just outside my desk along somebody's path, somebody with a hostile attribution bias may view the behavior as a deliberate intent to trip them. The person therefore is more likely to react with hostility and aggression to the placement of my foot compared to somebody who doesn't have a hostile attribution bias. Those with hostile attribution biases are also less likely to seek additional facts, generate alternative solutions, and think of the consequences of their aggressive behaviors. Research has indicated that the hostile attribution bias begins to develop during the early preschool years and seems to be stable throughout adulthood. There is also a significant relationship between experiencing peer rejection, maltreatment and abuse as a child, and the development of hostile attribution biases. This is not surprising, as these children are likely to become hypervigilant towards hostile cues and are therefore very ready to perceive hostility in somebody else's behavior. Thus, their hostile actions, which may result in them persistently breaking the law, could actually be their way of coping with and mastering the hostile environment that they perceive themselves to be living in. The General Aggression Model, or the GAM, is a social cognitive model that includes situational, individual, and biological factors that interact to produce a variety of cognitive, emotional, physiological, and behavioral outcomes. It is an attempt to integrate the different theories of aggression to actually explain why aggressive behaviors may occur. Firstly, it looks at the individual's perception of the environment. One of the concepts that we just covered, hostile attribution bias, comes into play here. If you remember, I said earlier that somebody with a hostile attribution bias somebody who perceives the environment to be hostile or aggressive in nature is more likely to draw on those cues. Those cues then are more likely to be interpreted as an act of aggression towards him or her. The person then is more likely to choose a cognitive script that would require him to act out an aggressive behavior. Thirdly, the expectation of the outcome as to whether he or she would be sanctioned or rewarded for the aggressive behavior, or whether he or she would be successful in carrying out the aggressive behavior, would also influence the individual's choice on whether to aggress or not. Finally, the individual's knowledge or belief about how other people would respond to the situation. For example, whether the aggression he or she practices would fit in with the social norms, would be sanctioned by others, or would receive reproving remarks from somebody else, would influence whether he or she chooses to aggress as well. According to this model, violence usually escalates from a specific triggering event. And this event will either be a serious event or a very benign event that is perceived to be hostile in nature. If the individual or group perceives the behavior to be, or the action to be, unjust or unfair, the individual or group may want to retaliate against the perpetrator or perpetrators. The model also suggests that violence could be a result of the deprivation of resources to meet the basic needs, and these basic needs could either be psychological, emotional, physical, or social in nature. Finally, the model also suggests that when potential human targets are dehumanized, it also is likely to intensify violent behaviors. This is something that we will look at a little bit more when we examine the concept of terrorism in future lectures, which will be covered next time. In this final section, we will look at some examples of how violence or aggressive behaviors play out in real life. There are many different forms of bullying, and traditionally bullying was seen as something that was physical in nature, where you hit, punch, kick someone, or verbal in nature, where somebody is insulted or called names. There is also social bullying, where, for example, an individual is ostracized by a particular group. Nowadays, there is a rise in another form of bullying, that is cyberbullying. Although cyberbullying may occurs in the virtual arena, its impact can be very real in the real life world, as its impact is usually emotional in nature. Please click on the link here to watch a video to see how cyberbullying resulted in one teenager attempting suicide. Unfortunately, such incidences are only becoming even more common, even in Singapore. Bullying is a pattern of behavior in which one individual is chosen as a target of repeated aggression by another individual or by a group of individuals. Bullies and victims can be categorized into three main categories. Firstly, some people are pure bullies, that is, they only bully, they are not bullied in return. Secondly, some people may be pure victims, that is, they are only bullied and they are not bullies themselves. And thirdly, some are bully victims, which means that they may be bullied and the victims in one situation, but they may be the perpetrator or the bully in another. An example of this is a child who is abused at home and is the victim of home violence or family violence, who then chooses to prey or target other children in the school environment where he or she is the bully. We know that when it comes to why people choose to bully, it is usually because the bully's perception of others is often guided by the hostile attribution bias that we talked about earlier. They may also bully because they want to hold power over somebody else or want to be able to control somebody else. Or they may bully somebody to be part of a group that is considered to be powerful, and this kind of bullying is usually a result of peer pressure. Finally, they may use bullying as a means to cope with negative feelings such as those associated with depression or feelings of helplessness. In most cases, bullying is not extreme, it is verbal, or it may be physical, such as pinching somebody, stealing from them, kicking them. It is not extreme in the sense that it does not result in extreme physical danger to the victim or near death, or does not involve near-death occurrences or incidences. In some cases, however, extreme bullying does happen. While it is not as common, it does have a much higher impact physically and emotionally when it does happen. If you click on the link here, it will take you to this article where you will read about how two girls who are 18 years old tortured another 14-year-old girl for 17 hours. What is interesting about this case is that the perpetrators were actually female offenders, and we do not usually associate females, especially those in their late teens, with extreme cases of bullying. Another arena or another location where aggression seems to be becoming more common is in the workplace. Workplace aggression is defined as any form of behavior through which individuals seek to harm others in the workplace. Usually, aggression in the workplace tends to be covert in nature, simply because overt aggression is not sanctioned or is not looked upon favorably. There are four major types of workplace aggression. Firstly, there are people who abuse their supervisory authorities. There is a supervisor who bullies his subordinate, either directly or indirectly. It could also include sexual harassment when it occurs between a superior and his or her subordinate. Expressions of hostility, which again are usually covert in nature, where you talk behind somebody's back or spread rumors about somebody. Obstructionism, where the perpetrator covertly tries to interfere with important activities involving the victim. For example, trying to impede the victim's career progression or block his possibility of being promoted. Very rarely, we have incidences of overt aggression where physical assault or even theft may occur in the workplace. Now, why does workplace aggression occur? There are many reasons for this. Firstly, it could occur because of perceived unfairness, where a group or an individual may feel that they are not being treated fairly. And so they try and deal or cope with this perceived injustice by using force or aggression. Examples of this include downsizing or layoffs, which results in employees being retrenched, or it could include, for example, the increased use of part-time employees, which means that full-time employees are also either retrenched or have their working hours cut down, which then affects their income. And sometimes when employees are unable to cope with their frustration in a legally accepted way or in a socially accepted way, they may turn to covert forms of aggression to actually cope with these changes at their work environment. The last type of aggressive behavior that we're going to look at in today's lecture is hate crimes. And hate crimes are basically violent acts which are directed towards a particular individual or members of a group merely because of the target's racial, ethnic, religious, or gender characteristics. And what is sometimes becoming more common now is the individual's sexual orientation. We know that hate crime is on the rise. In fact, as early as 10 years ago, almost 10,000 offences of hate crimes were reported, and in the US alone. Of this number, almost 50% was due to racial biases. As the world becomes more divided in terms of religion especially, the number of hate crimes is increasing. Hate crimes can be divided into four main categories. Firstly, thrill-seeking hate crimes, where the perpetrator actually engages in hate crimes for sadistic reasons, where he enjoys tormenting another individual or group. Reactive hate crimes, where the perpetrator actually targets a group as a form of defense when he or she feels that he or she is being threatened. Mission-based hate crimes, where the perpetrator feels that he or she is duty-bound to actually annihilate or get rid of a particular group because of his or her moral convictions. Or hate crimes can also be retaliatory in nature when they are committed in response to a hate crime that they themselves have been targeted of. And now the hate crime that they themselves have been targeted of could either be real or a perceived one. Watch this video to see how watch the video by clicking on the link here to look at an example of hate crime and its impact on the individual and the society around him. And that brings us to the end of today's lecture. If you have any questions, please either call me, make an appointment to see me, or email me. Thank you.